He was rude to the quiet stranger at the park until he realized that the stranger knew his deepest secret. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting an orange glow across the park. Dan had always found a strange comfort in walking through this place during sunset. It was his refuge from a life that felt like it was spiraling out of control. The demands of his job were growing. His relationships felt strained, and the secret he carried weighed on him like a stone in his chest, every day growing heavier. Dan approached his favorite bench, hoping for a moment of peace. But today, someone else was already sitting there, a man, middle-aged, wearing a shabby coat and an old hat that cast shadows across his face. He was sitting quietly, staring out at the pond, and it was clear he had no intention of moving. Annoyed, Dan walked up to the bench and stood there, waiting for the man to acknowledge him or move aside. The stranger didn't even look up. Dan felt a flash of irritation. It wasn't much to ask for just a moment of solace, was it? Dan sighed loudly, making his presence more obvious. The stranger turned his head slightly, finally noticing him, and then looked back at the pond without saying a word. "Mind if I sit?" Dan asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. The stranger gestured with a faint nod to the empty space beside him, and Dan sank onto the bench, deliberately keeping a bit of distance. For a moment, they both sat in silence. The only sound, the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing in the park. Dan's eyes flickered toward the stranger, taking in his appearance. The man was dressed in old, worn clothes, and his hat looked like it had seen better days. He seemed like the type of person who wandered from place to place, a drifter, perhaps. Dan wasn't in the mood for a conversation, but he found himself staring, curious despite himself. "You know, some things are better let go," the stranger said suddenly, his voice low and calm, his eyes still on the pond. Dan frowned, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" he replied, a hint of annoyance in his tone. The stranger turned his head slightly, looking at Dan with eyes that seemed to hold an unusual depth. "I said," he repeated, "some things are better let go." Dan shifted in his seat. He didn't like the direction this was going. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but I'm just here to relax," he said, trying to keep his voice even. The stranger smiled faintly, as if he could see through Dan's thin attempt at calm. "Are you?" he asked. "Or are you just trying to forget?" Dan bristled, his irritation growing. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm not interested in having this conversation." The stranger shrugged, turning his attention back to the pond. "It's not me you need to have the conversation with," he said softly. Dan clenched his jaw. Who did this man think he was? He looked like he didn't even belong here, and now he was trying to give advice? "Seriously, just mind your own business," Dan snapped, the anger he had been holding back spilling out. The stranger didn't flinch. He simply looked at Dan, his eyes calm and assessing. "I know about Rachel," he said quietly. Dan's heart skipped a bit. He felt as if the ground had just been pulled out from under him. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "I know about Rachel. The accident, the guilt you carry. It's eating you up, isn't it?" Dan's vision blurred for a moment, and he felt his entire body go cold. Rachel. That name was a wound that had never healed. Rachel had been his girlfriend, and they had been in the car together the night of the accident. She had begged him not to drive, told him he'd had too much to drink, but he hadn't listened. He had insisted he was fine, that he could handle it. The crash had been brutal. Dan had walked away with only a few scratches, but Rachel hadn't made it. She had died that night, and Dan had lived with the guilt ever since, the crushing weight of knowing her death was his fault. Dan stared at the stranger, his mind reeling. He had never told anyone the full story. His friends and family knew there had been an accident, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know that he had been the one driving, that it had been his recklessness that had killed her. "How do you know about that?" Dan stammered, his voice trembling. The stranger's expression softened. "I know because I've seen it before. People carrying burdens they think they have to bear alone. I see it in your eyes, the way you hold yourself, as if you're trying to outrun something that's always right behind you." Dan felt tears sting his eyes, and he quickly looked away, not wanting the stranger to see his weakness. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice cracking. The stranger reached out, placing a hand on Dan's shoulder. "You're wrong, Dan," he said gently. "I may not know you, but I know the pain of losing someone you love, of blaming yourself for something you can't change. You're not alone in this." Dan shook his head, trying to pull away, but the stranger's grip was firm, not letting him escape. "Rachel wouldn't want you to live like this," the man continued. "She wouldn't want you to be consumed by guilt." Dan felt something break inside of him, and the tears he had been holding back for so long finally spilled over. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. The stranger said nothing, just kept his hand on Dan's shoulder, offering silent support. After what felt like an eternity, Dan's sobs began to subside, and he wiped his tears, taking a shaky breath. "I've tried to move on," he whispered. "I've tried to forget, but I can't. It's my fault she's gone." The stranger nodded, his expression filled with compassion. "I know it feels that way," he said, "but holding on to this guilt isn't going to bring her back. It's only going to destroy you. You need to forgive yourself, Dan. It's the only way you'll ever find peace." Dan looked at the stranger, his eyes red and swollen. "How do I do that?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I forgive myself for something like this?" "You start by accepting that you're human, that you made a mistake. You honor Rachel's memory by living the life she would have wanted for you, not by punishing yourself. You reach out to the people who love you, let them in, and let them help you heal." Dan nodded slowly, the stranger's words sinking in. It wouldn't be easy, it would take time, and there would be days when the guilt would feel overwhelming. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, a way to let go of the past and find a future that wasn't defined by his mistakes. The stranger stood up, giving Dan's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, Dan," he said. "You just have to believe it." Dan watched as the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing down the path. He wanted to call out, to ask the man who he was and how he knew so much, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he sat there, the weight on his chest feeling just a little bit lighter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dan took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in years. It was time to stop running. It was time to face his past, to let go of the guilt that had held him captive for so long. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living again.